In the 14th century, and even in the 17th century, no word scared Europeans more than the word plague. And certainly, plague doctor was just as scary. Someone dressed as a plague doctor,
it would have been enormously scary to see such a figure approaching your village.
because it meant either that plague was on its way or plague was already in the village. The doctor dressed this way because in his beak he had rags with aromatic herbs. It was thought to ward off miasmas, which were thought to spread the disease. Miasmas were often in poor areas, which often were garbage dumps, which had fleas, and it was in fact fleas who characteristically spread plague in one form. His stick was used to poke buboes, which were swellings of the lymph glands, or to discard clothes. It could also be used to ward people away from him. His robe covered most of his body and his boots. He was wise to keep plague victims at a distance because it also had a more virulent form, a pneumonic form. Respiratory plague could infect you one day and you could be dead the next. That is no big surprise that under these conditions, many physicians decided that their calling lay elsewhere. I'm Gregory Pence. This is Great Stories in Bioethics, my personal YouTube channel, which I do as a hobby, in part to make sure that some of the stories and cases I've researched about and experienced over the last 50 years don't get lost. One of the interesting things about pandemic, and a pandemic is an epidemic that's worldwide, is that it often, it's often said that somebody caused it. And in the 14th and 17th centuries, it's no surprise that theologians said that humans had done something terrible to cause this and needed to atone. And so people marched from city to city, whipping themselves in atonement. And of course, these so-called flagellation processions were often people in dirty clothes, and often they had fleas. And so they unintentionally spread the plague from city to city. The Bible tells us that to atone, you often need to sacrifice a goat or even a human, the way God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. This is called a scapegoat. And in the 14th century, as the historian Barbara Tuchman tells us in her great book, A Distant Mirror, people often went to the Jewish quarter of a city and burned or killed the Jews because they were held to be responsible for plague. In the German city of Mainz, M-A-I-N-Z, in 1346, 6,000 Jews were killed and burned in one day. In the same century, when Mongols were besieging a city then called Kaffa, and today called Theodosia, which used to be in Ukraine before Russia took it over, the Mongols were hoping to accelerate the surrender of people inside who were behind walls and ramparts, so they catapulted the bodies of plague victims over the walls to introduce plague inside the city. Of course, the Mongol army got bit by fleas and got plague, and so it had to quickly skedaddle to avoid getting infected itself. The modern idea that plagues start with germs took centuries, even millennia, to be accepted. We now know that germs divide into bacteria, viruses, and protozoa, and those are the three things that cause epidemics. But for a long time, people blamed other things, especially bad character. And also, bad germs exist all over the world, but they need an amplification system to become a pandemic. So the AIDS virus, we know existed in Africa for a long time, but before there were international airports and gay bathhouses and blood supplies where blood was collected and pulled together, the AIDS virus couldn't really become an epidemic. Cholera is a good example. Cholera is spread, it's a bacteria that's spread in warm water contaminated by feces, and it needs an amplification system to become an epidemic or a pandemic. A lot of cholera originates in Russia, China, the Middle East, India. Take the Ganges River, where pilgrims come to bathe. They come from all over India and they go back to the village. If they drink contaminated water, it gets in their intestines, and they get cholera, and they bring it back to their village. In the Muslim world, cholera has become a pandemic when people went on a Hajj to Mecca or Medina, and then went back to their home countries. We often see cholera go around the world. We saw it in the 19th century come from Russia or England to North America. John Snow famously discovered that a contaminated diaper in the Broad Street pump had contaminated a whole area of London with cholera, but it took 50 years for physicians to accept his theory. When cholera came to North America, and it came in 3 great waves, it would come to Quebec or New York, and people in the South would say, gee, do you think it will come here? And of course it always did, as long as people can travel. So it was very, very hard to figure out how to stop it, and it could be devastating. In the Battle of Shiloh, which was one of the great turning points of the American Civil War, before Shiloh, people thought it was going to be a nice little war. The Shiloh, the casualties were just incredibly bad, thousands and thousands on both sides. But what's little known is that in the days afterwards, in Corinth, a little bit south of Shiloh, and both about 60 miles east of Memphis, just as many people died from typhoid and cholera. The historian Charles Rosenberg wrote a great book called The Cholera Years, basically describing how America dealt with it. And Birmingham is a good example, because Birmingham is surrounded by mountains, but in the Valley Creek, is where originally people lived. There were probably 1 saloon for every 10 people, so there were hundreds of saloons. They had sex workers. People got their water from Valley Creek, they did their laundry in Valley Creek, and their outhouses were near Valley Creek. So it was very easy for Valley Creek to spread any kind of bad bacteria once someone entered the valley with cholera. And at the first sign of cholera, Rosenberg tells us, the rich people would go up to the mountains, where they prided themselves on drinking clean water and not getting cholera. It was also thought that the people below, who are called the dirty, shifty Irish, and the sex workers, and the alcoholics, enslaved people, that they deserved it. I mean, look at their ways, and maybe they even caused the bad things of cholera. It's not very well known that European pandemics are what really wiped out the indigenous people of North and South America. It's often thought that military campaigns and superior guns and swords did so, but it's not true. The indigenous people had no acquired immunity from things like smallpox or cholera or plague, and they died in horrendous numbers. For example, in the Yucatan Peninsula in 1500, there were about 10 million indigenous people, and because of smallpox, a century later, it was down to 1 million. Smallpox had killed 9 million people, and there was basically no one to fight the invading Spanish armies. The first vaccine was created by Edward Jenner in 1796. He did it in an unethical way. He had observed that a maid infected with cowpox, which is related to smallpox, was immune from getting smallpox. So he created a very mild version of smallpox, had injected a young boy without his parents' consent or the boy's consent with his smallpox vaccine to see if later, when he was exposed to real smallpox, he would not get sick. And it was successful, and Jenner became a very, very famous physician. A century before Jenner, a slave, Onesimus, tried to tell people in the Northeast and North America about a technique that had existed in India and Africa for centuries. He didn't know the name. It was called variolation. But basically what it was is a healer would take a very mild case of smallpox, take the pus on a Q-tip or twig, and then take a healthy person, take a knife, make a wound, and then deliberately inject the pus of the mild case of smallpox into the wound of the healthy person. And in most cases, this gave the person a mild case of smallpox, and they were immune from later serious illness or death from smallpox. The physician Cotton Mather believed Onesimus and tried to tell other physicians and plantation owners about this technique to prevent the devastation of smallpox, but they all rejected Mather and Onesimus's wisdom and thought it was a diabolical plot to kill their masters. It's also said that in the Ohio Valley in 1836 that settlers and army officers who hated American native peoples deliberately gave them blankets infected with smallpox. That's never been proven, but it may be true because we do know that one of the presidents of Harvard, Increase Mather, publicly thanked God for giving the Indians smallpox so that the Europeans could have their lands. The Founding Fathers also feared yellow fever, which could be very devastating to white Europeans. Yellow fever originated in Africa, and over the centuries, many Africans had a quasi-immunity such that if they got infected, they didn't get really sick and they didn't die the way white people did. So when yellow fever first broke out in Philadelphia, people immediately fled if they could, and the ones who were left got sick pretty fast. In one famous case, some very noble black female nurses volunteered to take care of sick and dying white people, and unfortunately, not only were they not thanked for their service, but they were blamed for bringing yellow fever and causing it. Yellow fever also has an interesting historical note. It's responsible for the first successful slave revolt ever against colonial powers, which happened in Haiti. Napoleon was there at the time, and so many of his soldiers died of yellow fever that he had to leave. And when there was a slave revolt, there was no one there to fight against the slaves, and they took over Haiti. Napoleon was also bankrupt, and as a result, he had to sell all his lands in North America, west of Mississippi, to America, which we call the Louisiana Purchase. Countries in Europe and Asia have experienced pandemics for millennia, and they know a lot about how to deal with it. If a lethal germ breaks out and it's basically isolated to an area, they will impose a quarantine, or what the French call a cordon sanitaire. In 1821, yellow fever broke out in neighboring Spain, and French troops were sent to the border with Spain not to allow anyone to enter. It's basically a utilitarian concept. You have to, for the greatest good of the greatest number, isolate those infected, even though it means other people in the infected area might infect each other. But you can't make exceptions. And it's a natural human response to what your grandmother, your wife, your kids to get out first or to make an exception, but he can't do it. Just think of how if you allow one person from a plague village like your brother to come into your village and they bring a plea with plague, it's all over. Imagine if you let one person of Ebola come into the Atlanta airport, get on the people mover there, it's all over. You can't let anybody in. And that means you have to do some fairly drastic things. We know from movies, great movies like Outbreak and Contagion, that people will try to do this, and that you need the police and military to prevent them from either escaping or making exceptions. And you may have to do some pretty deadly things, even kill people for the greatest good, for the greatest number. This, of course, is only for a definitely very virulent, lethal germ, and not all germs are like that. So this is part one of kind of a three-part series on the ethics of pandemics. The last part will be about COVID. This was part one. In part two, we'll talk about all the ethical issues that were raised in America about polio and how mysterious it was. We'll talk about this so-called Spanish flu of 1915, 1918, and all the ways we didn't learn from it. We'll talk a little bit about Zika, SARS-1, some of the swine flu epidemics, the Hong Kong flu, and some of the things that happened along the way there. Hopefully this will help. We can learn something. We won't be ignorant of the past, so we repeat its mistakes. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you do, give me a thumbs up, subscribe. I'll see you again next Tuesday at 4 p.m.